Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is my buddy Bill DeMain. He's going to share a story about Peter Frampton.
I did a cover story for classic rock on Peter Frampton, and I spent 3 hours with him talking about his entire career, it starts when he was 15 years old. I mean, there were things about Peter Frampton that I didn't know. At 15, he joined a group called The Herd, and they had 2 top 10 singles in the UK, and he was a teen idol, a pinup. Then he got into Humble Pie. From Humble Pie, he went to his solo career. But one of the fascinating things that I didn't know about Peter Frampton is when he left Humble Pie, before he started his solo career, for about 2 years, he was a sought-after studio guitar player. And he played with Jerry Lee Lewis. He played with George Harrison. He played with Harry Nilsson. He told me that George Harrison called him and said, "Hey, would you come into the studio and play some guitar?" Not telling him what was going on. And he got there, and Phil Spector was in the control room, and George pulled Peter aside and said, "Look, I'm making this record, and Phil has this idea that he wants 19 of everything. So if you wouldn't mind, you and I are going to sit on these stools here with acoustic guitars and just track ourselves over and over on a couple of songs." And Peter said one of those songs was My Sweet Lord. So when you hear that huge, what George called the giant guitar on the intro, that beautiful strumming sound, part of that is Frampton, And he said it was amazing to be a studio player, working with all these musicians that he sort of idolized, especially George, because he was a huge Beatles fan. I asked him about Phil Spector because I never got to interview Phil Spector, but I'm curious about the people who've worked with Phil Spector, And Peter said, there really was, behind all his eccentricity, there really was something about his ears were so exquisitely fine-tuned. And Peter said, when we were tracking the guitar over and over again, I thought, how is this really going to make a difference, between just doubling it instead of doing it 19 times? And he said, I'll never forget when we walked in the control room and the first time the playback came through the speakers of these guitars, it was like, holy crow. It was just an orchestra. I mean, we know the expression wall of sound, but Frampton said he immediately had this new respect, for Phil Spector. He also worked with do you know who Joe Bryeth is? There's a great documentary made about this guy. He was a New York glam rock singer that had a very brief kind of tragic career where he was trying to be like a Ziggy Stardust character. And he was, in retrospect, was actually quite gifted and talented, but just had everything go wrong in his career. Like, was managed by a kind of mob-tied, ne'er-do-well character. But Frampton played on the Joe Bryeth record, and his sort of intersections with different people in pop music is remarkable. I'll bring Paul McCartney back into it again because Frampton told me a great story. I mean, one of the sort of tragedies in his career is after Frampton Comes Alive made him the biggest pop star on earth, in pretty short order, his whole career took a nosedive. Famously, he appeared on the cover of Rolling Stone shirtless, and it undermined any sort of musical credibility he had. He made a record called I'm in You, which was really kind of soft focus, bubble gum. But the thing that killed his career dead after Frampton Comes Alive was this disastrous movie called Sgt. Pepper's. It starred the Bee Gees and Aerosmith and Frampton. And Peter Frampton told me that he got a call from Robert Stigwood, who was the famous manager of the Bee Gees, who was the executive producer, putting together this multi-million-dollar, star-studded movie based on the Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper. And he told Peter Frampton, I want you to be the star of the movie. And Peter Frampton said, I don't know, I haven't really acted, and my music is my more important focus. Stigwood said, well, if it'll make any difference to you, I think we've got Paul McCartney on board to be in the, and Peter Frampton said, okay, that's all it takes. If I know that Paul McCartney's in it, I'm in. So they sent him the script, and he was like, this is really iffy. I don't have any lines, and what am I doing in it? Like, I don't understand, So it was a week before they started shooting. Frampton was in London, and Wings was doing a concert. So he went to the show, he went backstage, and he was talking to Linda, and he said, I'm really looking forward to being on set with Paul next week for the film. Linda said, what do you mean? He said, Sergeant Pepper. And Linda said, Paul, you want to come over and talk to Peter? And Peter said, you're going to be in the film, right? Paul said, no way. He said, I turned them down flat. And by then it was too late for Frampton to bail on the project. So he said it was the most painful. It was like a 6-month shoot because there wasn't really a finished script. So they were making it up as they went along, and there were just endless hours of sitting around, in those ridiculous kind of shiny band costumes. And he said he knew from the first week it was going to be the worst movie ever, but he couldn't get out of it. He was committed, And he said, sure enough, when it came out, it was, it was just trashed, savaged by critics. And because he was the face on the poster, the fallout was disastrous for his career. It took him a long time to recover. I think another good Frampton story is, when you see him on the cover of Frampton Comes Alive, the iconic image, he's playing a Les Paul Black Beauty from the 50s. That was his signature guitar. That guitar in the 1990s was thought to be lost. Frampton was doing a tour in South America, and the equipment for the tour was flown on a separate, smaller plane. That plane had a problem on the runway in South America and exploded and burned. And all of the equipment that was on the plane was thought to be lost. But apparently somebody at the airport rushed on board and took off a few pieces of gear, including the 58 Les Paul Black Beauty. They didn't give it back to Frampton. It sort of just entered the black market in the music scene in Sao Paulo or wherever it was in South America. And it fell into the hands of somebody who was just in a kind of wedding band, bar band, who played it for years. This guitar with the triple pickups, it's very recognizable, and played it until, it probably needed some work done and it wasn't staying in tune, and then just threw it in a closet. And it stayed in a closet for like 20 years. This guitarist's son grew up to be a musician when he was a teenager and said, Dad, can I use this old guitar that you have? I said, yeah, but it's not really playable, so you need to take it to a shop. So this kid took it to a shop. And by then, amongst guitar luthiers and repairmen, the word was out that this guitar might have survived and it might be, considered stolen. So as soon as the luthier repairman opened the case, he was like, I know what this is. This is Frampton's guitar. So he emailed a few other friends to verify, check the serial numbers and the distinguishing characteristics. And within a few days, word got back to Frampton. It's like, we have the Black Beauty. It's here, So Frampton's people contacted the luthier. The kid came back to the shop, and the luthier said, I can't give this guitar back to you because it's stolen, and the kid just ran out of the shop because he was afraid of being arrested. So after all these years, it's I think it was 2012 when this was all going on, Frampton was reunited with the Black Beauty, and he has it again, and he plays it in his shows, And there's a whole video on YouTube about, showing the sort of timeline of the thing and him finally getting the guitar back. And it's a beautiful story because we've all lost instruments that we've never gotten back. And for one to be that iconic and that famous and thought to be burned in a plane and then stole, there's a kind of poetry that the guitar that made him famous is finally back in his hands.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Does he call it the Phoenix now?
The Phoenix, yeah, because it rose out of the supposed ashes of the plane, right?
One of the most satisfying things of my adult rock nerd life is discovering just what a great guy Peter Frampton is.
Oh my God, the nicest. I mean, I would say Jody Stevens and Peter Frampton were to have a contest, it would be neck and neck. They were, I mean, for Peter Frampton especially, for all that he's done, he just wears it so lightly, and he's so enthusiastic about music and friendly and willing to laugh at himself. I mean, he was telling me that during the tour after Frampton Comes Alive, when he was just selling out stadiums and stuff, he said that this was right after Star Wars, the first Star Wars movie too, and he used to have a segment in the show where R2-D2, or a little replica that they had built, would come out and hand him a guitar on stage. And he said he got a cease and desist letter from George Lucas and said, I know you're a big rock star, but I own this character and I don't want it being part of your shows. So they had to retire the R2-D2, But he was laughing about it. It was, it's all just these sort of rock excess elements to his story are so, in retrospect, so laughable. He said I still have in a storage closet somewhere all the satin pants. He said I wouldn't dare try to put them on now because of the waist size and just the ridiculous. But he said I really enjoyed the moment that I had where I was in the limelight, not only because I was reaching a lot of people, but I just got to, he got to meet Cary Grant. And, when you're an international pop star, doors open everywhere,